Good afternoon. I think this is going to follow on naturally from the first two presentations. I'm going to speak from a paper unlike them, I'm afraid. I would just like to say that Pendry is a PR company, but one that wants to survive the AI bullshitting machine. And Internationalist Future is a think tank in development. I'm working with a fellow called Mark Seddon, who was an advisor to Ban Ki-moon at the UN on communications, but was also on the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party for many, many years. And our interest there is to try to find some way to link techno-innovation in all its aspects to issues of international relations. But let me get on with the talk. I'm cautious about some of the claims from the wilder shores of transhumanism and futurism, and I'm going to argue that over-enthusiasm is in danger of alienating and marginalizing the wider community. And I speak as somebody very practically engaged in politics over many years. And I want to look at three areas in particular. There's an engineering mentality, and by the way, I'm going to be a little extreme here, so I expect I might actually upset one or two of you. I don't like doing that, but it's good for the debate. An engineering mentality that confuses how people behave in the world with how materials behave. There's a science fiction mentality that extrapolates very small improvements in the present into future fantasy. And there's an anti-humanism implicit in some, and I emphasize some, transhumanist thought. My father was an engineer, so I hope you will not interpret the following in Freudian terms. But I see a pattern where those who are used to making things happen through the manipulation of matter, technologists, can often be blind to the complexity of human decision-making. I'm not going down the spiritual route here. Quite the contrary. I abhor such nonsense. Human decision-making is material, basically based on brain stuff. One of the mildly depressing turns of transhumanism in recent years, in the last decade, has been the arrival of a form of spiritualism, a spiritual type who fills the gaps in what we don't know with guff, whether eco-spiritual or something barely one step from New Age. I'm talking of something else entirely. I'm talking about the insights of a more existentialist philosophy, especially the philosophy of Martin Heidegger, because Martin Heidegger's great insight was into the working out of consciousness in time. Every one of the estimated 7.5 billion humans in the world is making calculations at multiple levels, every instant, over time, on what matters to them and in their relationship with others and the world. The amount of change within material reality created by these people is beyond even the most magical of transhumanist AGIs, but you would not think so from some radical claims about what technology could achieve. If you take big data, it's only as good as its inputs. Humans can choose, and I think I'm picking up a theme of an earlier speaker, can choose not only to provide data, but to falsify it or not give it at all. Bloody-minded screwing up of big data could become a subversive sport within a generation. Even with a commitment to data provision, not everyone will be connected all the time in every necessary way. Data will always be skewed at the social level. This complexity is what politics is all about. Humanity evolved as a social creature. That means he is a political creature, engaged by the very nature of his existence in a struggle for self-expression and power, as well as for resources, where morality is just as likely to be a tool as an end in itself. So what philosophers like Kant may say we should do is not actually what we do. Now, many transhumanists loathe this. They want humanity to be better than this. They want humanity to be better than this, not in terms of material existence, which is I'm definitely a comrade with you in the long march to techno-progressivism, but in terms of moral conduct and behavior. They want, in short, humans not to be humans. So being transhuman moves us here from being bettered as humans through technology to being better than humans. I think that's important, because that's the mistake made by Soviet engineers in the 1930s, whose material triumphs, by the way, have often been ignored for rather prejudicial Cold War reasons. Yet the ideology of Marxist-Leninist engineering was not just to build the Soviet equivalent of the Hoover Dam, but to create a new man out of scientific materialism, One result was Lysenkoism. So let me be clear here. I'm not making any accusations. I do not believe that most people in this room are that silly. My only point is that there is a tendency for futurists to ignore this dynamic reality of a human species that evolved biologically not only to be a social animal, but to be a highly effective social predator and survivor within its self-created ecological niche, which is society. Let's move on to the problem of science fantasy. If some futurists have a tendency to ignore the complexity of the species of which they are a part, some transhumanists seem to think transhumanist politics is some sort of chaos magic in its own right. So what do I mean? Chaos magic was a school of magical thinking of some sophistication. It postulated that we could transform the world and ourselves simply by adopting new beliefs and lifestyles, aware of what we were doing in order to shake up our inherited beliefs and assumptions. It was a way of psychologically renewing ourselves. There's nothing wrong with this at all. It's a form of socialized performance art or perhaps psychotherapy. Many people have had an awful lot of fun doing it, and they've changed their lives by adopting it. It's even had, at the margins, political effects, especially in anarchist circles. But such thinking could never be mainstream in providing practical long-term solutions to social and political problems. Our engineers would be more useful than our magicians here. Even if the engineers' failure to understand human complexity may have meant a world of unintended consequences. What the chaotic form of transhumanism does is to take some genuinely new development in science and then, and this is the hype story again, aided and abetted by journalists, expands and extrapolates it in an act of will into a radical new future for which there is no authority other than fantastic belief. It's one thing to say that 3D printing could transform manufacturing. It's quite another to make extravagant claims that this transformation of manufacturing inevitably means the collapse of capitalism and the return of the sort of artisanal manufacture that would have pleased William Morris. Adam Greenfield's recent book, Radical Technologies, although too pessimistic for my taste, is a good corrective to extravagant claims by techno-boosters, and I recommend it. One should be sceptical, though, of the skepticism at times. Too much futurist thinking is in danger of being marginalised amongst policymakers, and now I'm getting towards the politics, because it looks as if it comes straight out of the latest David Brin blockbuster, with ideas tumbling out to the detriment of the solid business of telling a straight story or offering an achievable policy. Some discipline and restraint is in order, because the future is far too important to be left to futurists, much as war is far too important to be left to the generals. Everyone in this room probably has something important to say to policymakers, but the language we use to present our ideas must be brought down to earth. It has to recognise the reality of the voter. He does not want to deal with people who think he should be displaced by robots, or by a genetically engineered Ubermensch. She does not want pie in the sky and apocalyptic claims about existential risk. Voters want clear guidance on how technology will affect them and their households' prospects in the near term. Politicians, on the other hand, are very bright generalists. Their primary focus is on acquiring and retaining power. To understand a politician, this you must understand. All moral suspicion of this doesn't amount to a hill of beans. This is just what politicians in a free society do. Those who do not like it are not going to overturn democracy and put in some platonic transhumanist guardians anytime soon. Meeting political reality halfway is going to be central to making technology work for society. Of course, we mustn't make the category error of confusing futurism, which I think is an intellectual technology that's notionally ideology-free, with transhumanism, which is actually an ideology. But there's an overlap. My criticism of the ideology is partly designed to offer a wake-up call to those promoting the technology. Some very deep Greens will see humanity as a burden on the planet. Of course, the planet really has no meaning except to those who create meaning around it, that is, humanity. Some transhumanists have become so ethically or intellectually appalled by humanity that their desire to be transhuman is essentially pessimistic and romantic. They desire a post-humanity, uploading, radical intervention, displacement by AI, enhancement or whatever. Now, everyone has a right to their beliefs. Such transhumanists have a right to theirs. But we should pause a moment and ask whether a deep inherent pessimism about humanity is not a rather destructive sentiment, a sort of psychological tic. because we find precisely the same type of negativity, not only from deep Greens, but from radical right traditionalists with their Kali Yuga, and from philosophical pessimists like Thomas Ligotti and his mentor in this matter, the Norwegian Peter Zapffe. Anti-humanism is deeply alienating to policymakers. It cannot be central to any intelligent transhumanism. Why? Because, as I've said before, the difference here has been an ideology of improving on the wider material human condition through the application of technology and the use of technology to change humanity, so that the human condition becomes irrelevant as a cause for concern. Choosing which attitude to take is a vital choice for futurists in politics, as opposed to private belief or philosophy. It means either that futurism is centred on the human future through effective use of technology, which is what Internationalist Future will be about, or transhumanism has become part of Ligotti's famous conspiracy against the human race. If it is the latter, or it is merely perceived to be the latter, technologists can kiss goodbye to influence in a popular democracy. The threat is that my three themes are combined into an elite-led, highly ideological, almost fascistic attempt to treat humanity as a problem, rather than concentrate on technology as a solution to human-scale survival. I say human-scale survival deliberately, as opposed to this language of existential survival, or planetary survival, or all such abstract nonsense. Technologists and futurists may have to start to consider a bit of a purge from their ranks of some conservative pessimists, fantasists, and anti-democrats, and start engaging with the political process as it is, rather than as they think it should be. For example, we've referred to our proposed work in international relations. One critical issue, which few have yet to come to terms with, is the potential damaging effect on emerging world economic development of a shift from cheap labour to automated manufacturing. This manufacturing might just as well be relocated to the West by capital and be serviced by a new working class of repairers, programmers, and in industries like fashion creatives. This would notionally be rather good for the West. Apart from the soft politics of humanitarian concern, there are substantive issues here that cut across national boundaries. Long-term migration effects, global poverty, protectionism, domestic training and education, management of trade flows, and the effects on our new multipolar world. China looks set to be a major winner because it's taking the bull by the horns here and has a transition model that does appear viable. Much of the world does not. Technologists need to be not to be extrapolating their inventions into the far future, but should be thinking about the ethical, social, and political conditions surrounding their work in the here and now. So pulling all this together, I'm making a strong appeal here for a pragmatic and self-disciplined approach to social and political matters from both futurists and transhumanists. The former, the futurists, must not be seduced by the exciting business of extrapolating current technological trends forward. They should be more aware of Clausewitzian friction in the human condition and the sort of anti-fragility issues raised by Taleb. I think Taleb's book Anti-Fragile, although a rather curious read, since it seems to be very personal at times, is nevertheless, once you get through those parts, a rather good analysis of what anti-fragile means to society. Human beings, at bottom, are not only very resilient, but they have a disruptive streak which has itself often secured human survival against the odds for thousands of years. The transhumanists, going to the ideology on the other hand, have to start making some ideological choices. Above all, to end any lingering negativity about the species of which they are part, whether they like it or not, and get down and dirty with the politicians to develop a positive techno-progressive agenda that centres on improving the human condition. Humanity can then improve itself on its own terms, rather than be improved by an elite. Some dialectic between market-based anarcho-capitalism and a form of nation-state-based defensive democratic socialism is likely to be the basis for our brave new world. The first innovates and takes risks. The second socializes and deals with the welfare of the masses. They sound as if they're opposites. The two are really two sides of the same coin. In my opinion, and it's no more than opinion, they may displace the ramshackle structures of Newtonian constitutionalism and offer a more relativistic politics based on recognition that we're a fluctuating network of individuals operating within a fluid social system. Now, I've used that analogy because I think it's important to understand that when physicists change our vision of the world, whether it be from Ptolemaic to Copernican to Newtonian, Newtonian to Einsteinian, our social systems, our structures, our philosophy move along with them. And Newtonian thinking, in many ways, with its tick-tock clockwork nature, its logic, its apparent smoothness, its levers, is the world that I think we have constructed as liberal constitutionalism in its most abstract form. I think we're moving into a new world, and that new world is going to be much closer to the relativistic space-time world of Einstein and those who followed him. That's a radical thought, but one I leave you with. Internationalist Future, just to close, mine's short, I'm pleased to say I think I've kept within time. I've got a thumbs up there. Internationalist Future hopes, subject to funding, and it is very early stage, I'm not going to hide that, hopes to look at these issues from a public interest perspective. Pendry White, on the other hand, will support innovation through its communications expertise, but it does want to avoid the very thing spoken of by Dean, which is the hype. Because this world isn't going to be created through foolishness and hype. The futurist and transhumanist communities have a huge part to play in this new world, in the dynamic public political education of what is actually possible for humanity from remarkable new technologies that will change us and our social forms in ways that no contemporary futurist can possibly predict. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Tim. And I have to say, I was so engrossed in what you were saying, I completely forgot my timekeeping duties.
Was I on time?
To hold it. Yes, indeed, you were on time. So that was very interesting, challenging. A few questions here, and then we may go to the floor. So, whether or not it's good to be critical of the existing state of humanity. So, is Internationalist Future critical of existing human collaborative systems? For example, the United Nations, are you happy with how the United Nations is operating, or do you have a vision for changing how that international collaboration works?
You've raised, well, first of all, we're not prescriptive. That's the whole point of being research, is that you're not prescriptive, and it's not ideological. But you've raised an extremely important point about what we want to achieve, especially coming from Mark, in particular, my collaborator. And that is that agencies like the UN are vitally important and need strengthening. They may need rethinking. They may need an awful lot of work to be done on all international institutions, but international institutions are a positive force, and we need to find some way, and I think this is at the core of what we're trying to do, some way to find a bridge between the nation state, which is the natural home for that defensive democratic socialism I'm talking about, and a global system which is more likely to be anarcho-capitalist, which is more likely to be innovative. So, for the simple reason that if a single nation state tries to deny a technology, another nation state will take it up. If one nation state tries to do something to do with tax, another nation state will take it up. So what we need is an international system that is not prescriptive, does not tell nation states what to do, but sets standards and sets down rules and frameworks for a civilized global community.
Rohit had a similar question asked to him as to what he thought the number of countries might be in the world in the future. He was bold enough to say he thought there probably will be fewer countries in the future rather than the nearly 200 there are today. Do you have any?
Well, I think it's absolutely unknowable. And the reason it's unknowable is because you have two different tendencies in operation. One is attempts at agglomeration. I think a very good point was made about the Middle East. I think once you can sort out the peace issues, which may take decades, there's a logic by the nature of the Arabic language and culture for those countries to come together, as well as in their competitive relationship with the rest of the world. However, there are also tendencies where communities with their own language and their own cultures would wish to separate out. Catalonia within the European Union springs to mind, Texas perhaps. This is why it's important to have a UN-based global framework. I'm going to say something really, really contentious that's going to upset probably the State Department, But I think the handling of North Korea is often overly aggressive and historically incompetent because of its failure to understand the history of the Koreas and of Korea. And I think this is what we need. We need people to start to think about how nations developed and not just dismiss them or try to throw them into some big organisation like the European Union.
So I can't resist then asking you, what advice would you give to the State Department officials?
Oh, now that's... No, it's too late. It's too late. It's too late.
No,
They should have asked me earlier.
You should have asked you earlier.
Should have asked me earlier. That's my answer.
Have to pay you double now, do
They had to pay me double now, yeah.
Yes. But it does, the different approach that you have in mind, is there a different way forwards for the threat from the North Korean situation?
You're asking me very specific, where I think at the moment, I wouldn't want to intrude into that quarrel, and for a very, very simple reason. We are where we are. What I'm talking about really is how did we get to where we are? What concerns me are the crises of the future. I think at the moment, I think we have a situation which is terribly tragic because if I'm an American, I am genuinely concerned that this small country may produce a missile that could slaughter an entire city of mine or my ally. And that is a terrible situation to be in. But I'm also looking at it from the other point of view, and I'm seeing a little country that has a history of fighting not only its own revolutionary war in order to become a nation again, but saw major powers squabble over it in the 1940s, and saw decades of the most appalling Japanese occupation. And its culture, its way of thinking grew out of those three events, which we have completely forgotten. So we're now in this tragic situation, which Hegel had a phrase, he said, tragedy is the conflict of right with right. And a tragedy is when two sets of values, which are incommensurate, clash, and you're asked to choose. So don't misunderstand what I'm saying about North Korea. I'm not supporting North Korea. I'm saying we could have done with a lot more understanding over a longer period of time.
With better foresight, we could have avoided
Indeed.
Getting things.
More futurists.
More futurists. Is better than human possible?
Is better than human possible? Now that's a deep philosophical question. I'm going to start.
Implied that transhumanists were naive or
no
judged in thinking
no.
that something better than human was possible.
Well, all right then. All right, this is a big issue, but I'm going to try to do it easily for myself. I don't think you can be philosophically better than human because you will always be human. By the very definition of being human, you can never be better than yourself. If you're better than human, then you have ceased to be human. That's just simple. That's simple. If you're better than human, then you're post-human in some form. Now, what I'm saying about transhumanists, and there's a danger in the very word transhumanism, passing over humanism, and my philosophical hero is Nietzsche, and Nietzsche had a concept of the Ubermensch, the idea of the transhuman. But what he really meant was being better as a human, being better as this thing that is human, which is constrained by the past and by society and by your own weaknesses and your own psychology. Okay? It's to be human. I'm being deep philosophy here, but my point is, I think that when transhumanists speak, I often say that some transhumanists seem to whiz off into this idea that this thing that is human can somehow be made better in ways that are really in their heads.
Let's take some questions from the floor. Let's come down here.
Thank you then for such a thought-provoking presentation. I think we all need it, and we need to think out of the box. I agree with a lot of said. It really relates to transhumanism in large part. And you just said a minute ago that can we be better than humans? Transhumanism has many faces and many degrees of departing, if you like, from what humanity means. So I'm not going into the philosophy, I'm going into the practicality. I think you missed two or maybe three major points. The first one is that you do not appreciate, it seems, that change is exponential in every aspect of our life. And we simply are getting out of time. The second thing is that I feel that you dismiss existential risks. They do exist, and one of them is superintelligence. And transhumanism, or some branches of it, have won the recipe for essentially saving us through some kind of merging what is best in us and humans in order to overpower superintelligence. And the third aspect of what you just said towards the end of your presentation about the United Nations is, I think, really stemming from the politics as such. United Nations, and I've been with United Nations for most of my life, really supporting the United Nations, but it has had the time. It is disastrously in the 19th century thinking. You mentioned nation states. We have to think planetary. We have to actually limit our sovereignty in order to survive.
Tim, you can spend a long time.
Yes, I'll be short.
I
just make a brief point, yeah. The first point I'd make is I was being deliberately provocative, and you understand that. I know you understand that. So I do respect your points, actually. I do respect that transhumanism is a very broad church, and it's got room for everybody. And so you must understand what I'm saying here is about how transhumanists or techno-progressives, I prefer to use the word, can actually influence practical politics. And I'm drawing a distinction between the theory, the pleasure of thinking, the pleasure of ideology, and actually changing the world. So that's the first point. The second is that in that context, the theory of existential risk, the theory of superintelligence, and so forth, these are extremely valuable thought experiments to undertake. And there are reasons for concern. However, I do believe that there's been a degree of overemphasis on them, and I think there's a degree of rigidity of thinking about them, and there's certainly a degree of an inability to understand just what a ruthless survival animal humanity is, and what it will do to win. And we're not factoring that in. And then finally, because I can't stand here all day expatiating, the UN, you're absolutely right. I think that's a fair point. I think that's why we're also trying to pragmatically build a bridge here. To simply say that the UN must be respected as it is just no longer functionally appropriate. It is past its time as it is. It's not working. I think it started to fail to work when when another superpower collapsed, simply started to ignore it and started to ignore the rules. But on the other hand, this is the only place I'm really going to disagree with you profoundly. I really am going to disagree with you. This myth of the planetary government, this myth that we can all come together in some kind of wonderful, happy home where we're all going to love each other, it ain't going to happen because we're human. There's nothing wrong with that. We're actually quite lovable in many ways. We certainly do some interesting things. And we need to rewrite the UN and other international organisations for that human reality under conditions of what I call relativistic politics, networked politics, connected politics. And we need to, and this is where I really am going to disagree with you, we need to strengthen the nation state, not weaken it. We need stronger nations, we even need stronger tribes, as long as those tribes are humane, and religion. I mean, I'm completely and utterly non-religious, which I'm saying on camera. I completely. But I do respect others. Others are not. And those people have as much rights as I do.
Just very quickly, I didn't mean planetary in the sense that we all embrace our which is needed. I was thinking about pragmatic approach. We need to share part of our sovereignty in order to survive as humanity, as civilization. That's what I meant.
That's a fair point, and that's another debate which I won't have here because we haven't got time, but we could have a private debate about what we mean by these issues of sovereignty. It won't surprise you that I'm probably probably one of a few people in the room who was a hardline Brexiter. I know, yeah. Scary. Seriously.
Let's have another question.
Good man. I really enjoyed your provocations just to push back gently on two of them and slightly to wonder whether they subvert your intention of building a consensus, building acceptability for technical progressive ideas. One would be, you really aren't against the science fictional mentality entirely, are you? Because when I think of writers like Kim Stanley Robinson or Cory Doctorow or even Neil Stevenson, When I think back to New Atlantis, Francis Bacon in 1500s, I remember it was, basically anticipating most of our current technosphere. Surely it's a bit better science fiction, which helps to create narratives that get people ready for or people to question or criticise change. And Spike Jonze's She is an amazing meditation on what AI could do to our social relations. And your second provocation on spirituality and religion, I mean, surely something like Buddhism, in terms of understanding our coming webbed identity, or Neo-Confucianism, which helps us understand how to live in balance with systems. I mean, it's just sort of slightly Dawkins-esque to be so militant about the epistemological and ontological irrelevance of religious and spiritual thinking when it's powerfully, metaphorically motivating the way that people see and act in the world for thousands of years, but probably for decades and centuries to come, and probably new ones to come as well. So just science fiction, pushing back on your polemical points about science fiction and spirituality.
Yeah, good points. In fact, I could become a thorough bore on how I think science fiction has become decadent in recent years for precisely the reason that you're saying. Science fiction has been an incredibly important mobilizatory cultural tool, and it's at its best when it takes a few good ideas and pursues them to their logical conclusion. I mean, there are some, people like Brian Aldiss springs to mind. There's a book, many of you will have read Seven Eves, recently published, which is superb. I use David Brin, and not because I'm personally attacking David Brin, but there's this tendency to throw so many ideas in without any context that you get the sense that there's an audience of nerds and geeks out there that just want lots of ideas in their head. And this isn't really what science fiction should be about. Genius science fiction is William Gibson creating cyberpunk, yet knowing absolutely nothing about computers. And H.G. Wells. So I'm with you on that one. Religion, I'm not so with you. Only in the sense that, and I suppose I do have a religion. I'm a hardline existentialist. I mean, a real hardline, okay? And that's a form of religion to me. It's a way of seeing the world. And I get that a Buddhist, a Neo-Confucian, a Christian, evangelical, who I also would respect, a Jew, goes through the list, a Hindu. These are ways of seeing the world. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I see them as ways that people, persons, deal with the world. The materiality of the world, which is what I think techno-progressivism is about, and improving society, shouldn't really have anything to do with that. And that's going to be a difference of opinion. That's just going to be a difference of opinion. Because as soon as the religious guys, as soon as they get into society, they start telling me what to do. And I don't like that. I really don't like that. Okay?
One last question here.
Okay, provocative talk on that. A couple of quick points. I'm with you, I think, with Nietzsche. The hope for humanity, I think, is to make humans be better human beings, and to really, for us to source this good side of us, which we don't do. And I think this comes down to the way we prepare our generations to live in this world. So education is absolutely fundamental. And also the way we do politics, which I think certainly in this country and probably across the world is hopeless. There's a much better way in which we can do politics and how societies can be run. I think that's the absolute focus, and I believe that's what we're going to be talking about, and you've mentioned in the next session. They're fundamental. All this stuff, I don't like the word transhumanism, as I told David. I really don't like it. I don't think people like it. We're human beings, and we're going to be human beings, and we will be in charge, I believe, for whatever we do.
Well, I'll be brief because I think we're running out of time, aren't we? But we're at one on this. We're dealing with persons. I mean, if I can just make two small comments. The one is, if we go back to dear old Nietzsche, what he's looking at is this problem for us as humans, that our consciousnesses, in a way, that we're caught between the animal and the divine. We're not gods, and we're not animals.
But we are intelligent.
But we are highly intelligent, highly conscious, self-referential. But we've got a bit of the animal in us, And we've got a bit of the, we can think like gods. We can think like them. We can think as if we are. And so that tension, that dynamic, and it goes back to this point about mental health, the road that it's making, which I think is incredibly profound. It's something we're not dealing with, but we have to be very careful here, because an awful lot of this, what we think of as mental health problems, are also transformative internal problems. There's a real danger that we become so, we put ourselves in so much cotton wool, we don't challenge ourselves with depression, anxiety, horror, hate, love, but we balance it all down. We become this cuddly liberal society where everybody's nice to each other, but we don't actually do anything. We're born, we die, and we haven't done anything, we haven't lived. Yeah? And for me, transhumanism, which I hate the word too, with due respect, but I know we've got it. But transhumanism, if you're going to mean anything, it's got to be that it teaches us to live. And I won't get into, because we haven't got time, I won't get into the political point, because that's big.
Because there's a lot more that we're waiting for later on in this event. We've got 3 fantastic talks after a short break, but let's give a great round of applause to Pendry.